Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a document that gives us a really specific view on a major legislative proposal happening in Sri Lanka.
That's right.
We've got our hands on a submission recommendations sent by a group of citizens and civil society members. It went to the Minister of Justice and National Integration just recently, May 30th, 2025.
Yeah, and it's a perspective right from inside Sri Lanka. They're laying out their worries, their arguments, specifically against a proposed new anti-terrorism bill.
So our mission here for you is to unpack this document. We want to pull out the core arguments, understand why, from their viewpoint, these groups are so concerned about this potential law.
And also look at what they suggest instead. It's all based purely on what's in this submission.
Exactly. So get ready, because we're going to explore what this particular group really wants you to know about this bill.
Okay.
All right, let's get right into it then. The document, it actually starts by acknowledging something potentially positive.
Right.
The government's stated plan to repeal the old Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1979, the PTA. That law has a long and pretty controversial history.
It does, but here's the turn. While they definitely support ditching the old PTA, they immediately express being greatly disappointed by the move to bring in a new anti-terrorism bill. Their central claim, it seems, is that this new bill isn't real reform. They say it just replicates the same repressive procedures as the old PTA, just with a different label.
So the core worry right up front is this isn't change, it's just continuation.
That seems to be the crux of it, yes.
Why is that legacy, the shadow of the old law, so problematic for them? What does the submission say about that?
Well, they spend quite a bit of time on the history of the PTA, based on their own experiences and what they've observed. They flat out argue it's been a tool for severe human rights violations for decades.
And they list specifics, don't they? I saw mentions of things like, stifling free speech.
Yes, that's prominent.
Arbitrary detention, just holding people without a clear legal reason.
Right. And prolonged detention, too, sometimes without even an inquiry or charge.
And even torture is mentioned as something linked to the PTA.
It is. The submission claims it was used to silence activists, people speaking out against injustice. And they make a really strong point about social unity. They argue the PTA severely damaged peaceful coexistence in the country.
And there's a focus on discrimination.
Very much so. They specifically highlight its discriminatory application, naming Tamils and Muslims as ethnic and religious minorities targeted by it.
Okay.
They argue the law was systematically used to, suppress the ability of these communities to express political dissent or even just commemorate their history or seek justice for things that happened in the past.
Wow. So even potentially criminalizing normal social activities.
That's what they claim, yeah. Lawful social and cultural expressions sometimes fell afoul of it, according to this document.
So this submission paints a picture of the PTA creating a real climate of fear.
Exactly. Discouraging legitimate dissent, eroding public trust in, the courts, the police, the whole justice system.
Right.
So their point is trying to bring back anything that feels like that law just continues this whole cycle of harm and division.
Okay, so that's the historical baggage they're bringing. Now, moving to the proposed new bill. What are the specific worries they raise about it mirroring those old problems?
They warn pretty directly that if this new bill does replicate PTA practices, it's a severe threat. A threat to democratic rights, civil liberties for everyone in Sri Lanka.
And they mean things like the arbitrary arrests again.
Yes, they explicitly mention things like arbitrary arrests and, crucially, prolonged detention without trial. They fear these things, which they say were common under the PTA, could become even more embedded, more institutionalized under a new law. Solidified, almost.
And they link this to the idea of national security. That term can be quite broad.
They do. The submission says the new bill might allow silencing dissent under that vague sort of pretext, bypassing normal legal protections due process.
Okay, I see.
And again, they hammer home the concern about the impact on minorities. They argue, look, continuing these kinds of practices under a fresh law would just deepen ethnic divisions. It undermines any effort towards reconciliation, building good faith, building peace.
Which naturally leads to the question they raise. Is a new law like this even necessary? What's their take on the existing legal framework in Sri Lanka?
Their argument is quite strong here. They say Sri Lanka already has a robust legal structure.
Such as?
They point to the penal code, the regular criminal law. They mention the ability to use emergency regulations, but only when genuinely needed. And there are laws specifically addressing organized crime.
Okay.
They state these are sufficient. Sufficient to counter genuine threats of terrorism or violent extremism without needing these kinds of extraordinary separate measures.
So their position reading this document is basically the toolkit is already there.
That's the argument. They say a new anti-terrorism bill, especially one granting really broad powers, likely to security forces, given the context, isn't justified. There's no evidence presented, they imply, of current security threats that demand such extreme steps.
So what should be the focus, according to them?
Strengthening the implementation of the laws we already have. Through accountability, through transparency, not by creating these parallel legal systems that kind of bypass normal judicial checks and balances.
That's interesting. Let's touch on that historical point they made earlier.
Mhm.
The PTA, introduced as temporary in '79, lasted over 40 years.
Right.
What does the submission say about the risk of, well, history repeating itself with a new bill?
Mhm.
The risk of permanence?
They call the PTA's history a dangerous precedent, plain and simple. Their view is that any new anti-terrorism bill, no matter what promises are made about it being temporary, carries a real danger.
The danger of becoming permanent again.
Exactly. Another permanent fixture in Sri Lanka's legal landscape, that's the fear.
And who do they say typically gets caught by these kinds of laws in practice, based on their experience?
They state very clearly that often these laws end up being used not primarily against actual terrorists, but against, well, political opponents. Journalists, civil society activists, even just ordinary citizens who are trying to exercise their democratic rights.
So misuse is a major concern.
A huge concern. Their experience, as written here, shows that once you grant these kinds of extraordinary powers, they're almost never given up easily. They tend to stick around.
Okay, so if they're so strongly against this proposed bill, what's the alternative? What's their vision for how Sri Lanka should handle security threats and build a stable society? What does the submission propose?
Well, their call is for a fundamentally different approach. They argue that if you really want to combat violent extremism and terrorism, the focus has to be on fighting injustice, not on just piling on more repression.
So security through justice, not security at the expense of rights.
Precisely. They state very clearly, national security cannot be achieved, in their view, by sacrificing civil rights, human rights, or democratic freedoms.
And they make the point that silencing dissent, or criminalizing peaceful assembly, or locking people up without due process things they associate with the PTA,
Yes.
that doesn't actually build security.
No, they argue it does the opposite. It breeds alienation, it builds resentment, and that leads to long-term instability, not safety.
So what's the positive vision then?
The submission calls for a genuine commitment to inclusive governance, to the rule of law applied equally, and to responsible leadership, meaning strengthening the institutions that are meant to protect all citizens equally, regardless of ethnicity, religion, political views. They specifically mention the judiciary needs to be accessible. Its oversight shouldn't be blocked by sweeping national security claims.
And the role of civil society.
Crucial. Their voices must be heard, valued, and not suppressed. That's integral to their vision.
So the bottom line message from them is pretty stark. This new bill, if it's like the PTA, is absolutely a step in the wrong direction.
Unambiguously, yes. And the document ends with a very strong collective call to action. It's directed right at the government and the committee drafting this bill.
Okay, and what are those specific demands? What does this group want them to do?
They urge them, quite forcefully, to listen. Listen to civil society, listen to legal professionals, listen to the communities who are most affected by the old law, and also listen to international human rights bodies.
And the demands themselves.
They list 3 specific points. 1, flatly reject the proposed anti-terrorism bill as it stands.
Okay.
2, reject the replication of any laws that they believe pose a danger to democratic values.
Right.
And 3, uphold the fundamental right of the people to freedom, dignity, and peace.
So they frame this as more than just about one piece of legislation. It's about learning from the past.
Absolutely. Learning from, as they put it, Sri Lanka's decades of war, suffering, and what they see as the authoritarianism linked to the PTA. They argue the way forward has to be through laws that are people-centered.
Rooted in rights and justice.
Exactly, not repression and control. Their task, as they see it and present it here, is to help build trust, foster real dialogue, and push for legislation that actually serves freedom and justice.
So we've taken a real deep dive into this specific submission now. We've seen their, well, profound opposition to this proposed new Anti-Terrorism Bill.
Yes, a very clear stance.
We've dug into their reasoning, which is clearly rooted in their interpretation of the PTA's history, its claimed impact on human rights, particularly on minority communities.
Hmm.
We've understood their argument that the existing laws are actually enough if used properly.
Right.
And there's significant worry that any new law, especially one like this, could just become another permanent tool for misuse, just like they argue the last one was.
Yeah, this document really does powerfully articulate the perspective of these particular civil society groups. It outlines their specific fears and proposes a very different path forward,
A path they see based on justice, rights, and trust.
rather than just expanding state power in the name of security.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. If, as the submission argues so strongly, true long-lasting security doesn't actually come from more control and repression, but instead from empowering citizens and rigorously upholding their rights, well, what does that imply? What does that fundamental difference in approach suggest about the best way for any society, really, to navigate complex security challenges?